An empty tomb. Testimonies that defy logic. The greatest mystery of the Christian faith still echoes, intriguing skeptics and solidifying the faith of billions. Is the resurrection of Jesus an inexplicable miracle, or are there other narratives? Let's unravel it. To explain the basis or foundation of the central theme, establishing its roots or origins. For Christianity, the resurrection of Jesus is not merely a historical event, but the cornerstone upon which the entire faith is built. Its origin and foundation are deeply rooted in the New Testament scriptures, which serve as the primary source of information about Jesus' life, death, and, crucially, his return. The four canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, along with the Pauline epistles, offer detailed and, at times, complementary accounts that were compiled relatively close to the events they describe, which gives them significant weight for believers and historians. The biblical narrative begins with Jesus' crucifixion, an event widely accepted even by secular historians like Flavius Josephus and Tacitus. After his death on the cross, Jesus was reportedly buried in a new tomb belonging to Joseph of Arimathea. The concern of the Jewish, religious leaders about the disciples possibly stealing the body and claiming a resurrection is an interesting detail. In Matthew 27-62-66, they asked Pontius Pilate to have the tomb guarded by soldiers and sealed with a large stone, which indicates that the idea of a resurrection was already a concern and in some way anticipated by the adversaries. This, ironically, ends up strengthening the claim of an empty tomb on the third day, as a military guard was present. On the third day after the crucifixion, the gospel narrative recounts that a group of women, including Mary Magdalene, went to the tomb to anoint Jesus' body. To their surprise, the tomb was empty. The large stone ceiling had been removed, and the Roman guard was absent or in shock. In some accounts, angels appear to announce that Jesus was no longer there, for he had risen. The descriptions of Jesus' appearances are varied and occur in different contexts over 40 days before his ascension. He is seen by Mary Magdalene by the apostles in Jerusalem, on the road to Emmaus by the Sea of Galilee, and notably by more than 500 people at once, as Paul reports in 1 Corinthians 15:06. This mention by Paul is particularly relevant as it is one of the oldest sources in the New Testament, written around 55 AD, less than 25 years after the events. Paul even challenges readers to go and speak with the witnesses who were still alive at the time, which suggests a belief in the verifiability of the event. The centrality of the resurrection to Christian faith is undeniable. It was not merely a return to life, but a transformation that validated Jesus' claims about his divinity and his dominion over death. The boldness of the apostles, who were previously afraid and scattered, was radically transformed. From a discouraged group, they became fearless preachers, willing to face persecution and martyrdom. The change of the day of worship from the Jewish Sabbath to Sunday, the Lord's Day, is another manifestation of the resurrection's importance. This new day celebrated Christ's victory over death, becoming the central point of Christian worship. For the early Christians, the resurrection was not an abstract idea or a secondary theological concept. It was a living reality that liberated them from the fear of death and gave them the hope of eternal life. It was the confirmation that God had accepted Jesus' sacrifice and that he was, in fact, the promised Messiah. As the Apostle Paul emphasizes in 1 Corinthians 15:14, if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. This passage underscores that the resurrection is the foundation upon which all Christian doctrine and practice stands. It is from these fundamental accounts and their profound theological significance that the entire discussion about the inexplicability of the resurrection, its mysteries, and its implications unfolds, making it the core of our central theme. To present initial examples or manifestations of the central theme, illustrating it with relevant cases or situations. The news of the empty tomb and Jesus' subsequent appearances were not met with immediate and universal acceptance, not even among his closest followers. On the contrary, the initial reactions were marked by a complex mix of skepticism, fear, confusion, and, eventually, a deep and transformative devotion. This journey from disbelief to unwavering faith is one of the most powerful manifestations of how the central theme of the resurrection solidified in the minds and hearts of early Christians. One of the most iconic examples of this transition is the episode of Thomas, Didymus, in John 20:24-29. The other disciples tell Thomas that they have seen the resurrected Lord, but he refuses to believe. His famous statement, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe," reflects a demand for empirical evidence, a palpable skepticism that echoes the doubts many would have faced with such an extraordinary event. Jesus' response, appearing to Thomas and inviting him to touch his wounds, culminates in Thomas's poignant confession, "My Lord and my God." This moment not only validates the reality of the appearance, but also illustrates the need for personal and direct validation for belief to flourish. The women who went to the tomb also offer a valuable perspective. Although they were the first to discover the empty tomb and receive the message from the angels, and even to encounter Jesus, their initial reports were met with disbelief by the disciples. Luke 24:11 states that their words seemed to them like nonsense, and they did not believe them. This underscores the difficulty of assimilating such a disruptive reality, even for those who expected a Messiah and had heard Jesus predict his own resurrection. Acceptance came as other testimonies and appearances accumulated. The narrative of the disciples on the road to Emmaus is another vivid example. Two disciples were disheartened and confused after the crucifixion, discussing the events with sadness. Jesus joins them on the road, but they do not recognize him. Only when he opens the scriptures to them and, crucially, when he broke bread in their presence, are their eyes opened and they recognize him. This story demonstrates that understanding the resurrection, for some, did not come merely from an immediate and identifiable appearance, but through a process of revelation and interpretation of prophecies, where full recognition occurred in a moment of intimacy and communion. The most significant impact, however, is the radical transformation of the disciples. Before the resurrection, they were scattered, frightened, and disillusioned. Peter had denied Jesus 3 times. After the appearances and subsequently the event of Pentecost, described in Acts 2, these same men became bold and fearless preachers, willing to face persecution, imprisonment, and, in many cases, martyrdom for their faith in the risen Christ. The courage of Peter, the change of attitude of James, Jesus' brother, who initially did not believe in him, according to John 7-5, but became a leader of the Jerusalem church, and the dramatic conversion of Saul of Tarsus, who was a persecutor of Christians and had a personal experience with the risen Christ, are notable examples of this transformation. These initial manifestations illustrate that belief in the resurrection was not a passive or unthinking acceptance. There was room for doubt, for disbelief, and for the need to see to believe. However, the strength of the testimonies, the consistency of the appearances, and the personal experiences of encountering the risen Christ were so powerful that they converted doubt into fervent devotion, propelling the early Christian movement with an unwavering conviction in the central theme, shaping the faith of billions throughout the centuries. To deepen the understanding of the central theme, exploring its underlying laws, patterns, or mechanisms, to grasp the depth of the inexplicable miracle of Jesus' resurrection, it is essential to examine the main secular hypotheses that seek to offer alternative explanations to the supernatural account. Analyzing these theories along with their respective counterarguments not only helps, Yes, understand the complexity of the phenomenon, but also to perceive why for many the explanation of the divine resurrection remains the most coherent and satisfactory in light of historical facts and testimonies. Counter-argument. The oldest and most persistent hypothesis is the fraud or theft theory. Interestingly, this theory is already mentioned in the Gospels themselves. Matthew 28:11-15 reports that the chief priests bribed the Roman guards to spread the version that the disciples had stolen Jesus' body while they slept. Argument. The disciples, or perhaps other sympathizers, would have stolen Jesus' body to simulate the resurrection, fulfilling prophecies, and keeping the messianic movement alive. This deception would be necessary to maintain the faith and power that Jesus had accumulated. Counterargument. Motivation and sacrifice. It is highly unlikely that the disciples would have the motivation to die for a lie they themselves invented. The vast majority of the apostles and many early Christians faced persecution, torture, and martyrdom for their faith in the resurrection. People rarely willingly die for a hoax they created and knew to be false. Ability and security. Jesus' tomb was sealed with a large stone and guarded by Roman soldiers. Security was strict. Stealing the body, unnoticed by trained guards, and the silence of all involved in such a massive conspiracy would be extremely difficult to execute. Transformation of the disciples. The radical change in the disciples' behavior, from frightened and scattered to bold and confident preachers, is difficult to reconcile with the perpetration of fraud. If they knew it was a lie, their enthusiasm and conviction would be unsustainable. The second hypothesis is the swoon theory, or reanimation theory. This theory, popularized in some eras, suggests that Jesus did not die on the cross, but merely fainted due to exhaustion and injuries, and was later revived in the cold environment of the tomb or by external intervention. Argument. Jesus would have survived the crucifixion and later woken up in the tomb. He then would have left and appeared to the disciples, who, in their state of mourning and belief in the supernatural, would have mistaken him for a resurrected being. Counter-argument. Physical condition. Crucifixion was a brutal and effective form of execution, designed to lead to death by asphyxiation, shock, and exhaustion. Jesus endured severe scourging, blood loss, and the piercing of his side by a spear. A man who survived such torment would hardly have the strength to remove a heavy stone from the tomb, overcome the Roman guard, and appear triumphant and healthy, convincing his followers that he had conquered death. On the contrary, he would be in a critical and dying state. Roman medical knowledge. The Romans were masters of executions. The death of a crucified person was usually verified by a centurion, who had to confirm the death before releasing the body. Testimony of death. The Gospels and the historian Josephus confirmed that Jesus was dead before being taken down from the cross. The third hypothesis is the collective hallucination or myth theory. This explanation suggests that Jesus' appearances were subjective psychological experiences, or that the story of the resurrection developed as a legend or myth over time. Argument. The disciples, traumatized by Jesus' death and filled with messianic expectation, would have experienced individual or collective hallucinations, which were interpreted as appearances of the risen Christ. Alternatively, the resurrection story would have gradually evolved as a myth to strengthen the group's belief and identity. Counter-argument. Nature of appearances. The appearances varied in location, time, and number of people, individuals, small groups, and to more than 500 people simultaneously, according to 1 Corinthians 15:6. Collective hallucinations of this type are extremely rare and usually occur in environments of great excitement with susceptible participants and in the same context. It is unlikely that multiple groups in different scenarios would experience the same hallucinations so consistently. Physical contact and meals. Several biblical accounts describe Jesus eating with the disciples, allowing them to touch him and inviting Thomas to put his finger in his wounds. Hallucinations rarely include such vivid physical interaction and shared meals. The empty tomb. The hallucination theory does not explain the crucial fact of the empty tomb. If the appearances were merely hallucinations, Jesus' body would still be in the tomb, which would quickly refute the claims of resurrection. Growth of Christianity. A movement based on hallucinations and false myths would hardly have the strength, persistence, and ability to spread throughout the Roman Empire and endure for 2 millennia, facing intense persecution. Finally, the wrong tomb theory. This hypothesis suggests that the women went to the wrong tomb on Easter morning and, finding it empty, presumed that Jesus had risen. Argument. A location error in the dark or in confusion would have led to the mistaken belief in the empty tomb. Counter-argument. Identification of the tomb. Joseph of Arimathea's tomb was new and presumably well known to those who buried Jesus and the women who observed him being placed there. Mary Magdalene, in particular, is described as knowing where it was. Authorities. If it were the wrong tomb, the Jewish or Roman authorities would have had an enormous interest in discrediting the resurrection. They could easily have presented Jesus' body from the correct tomb, debunking the story in a matter of hours or days. This never happened. By analyzing these secular hypotheses, it becomes clear that each presents significant flaws and fails to satisfactorily explain all historical facts. The profound transformation of the disciples and the nature of the New Testament testimonies. The underlying mechanism of the mystery of the resurrection for believers transcends a purely material explanation, leading to the conclusion that the miracle is the only explanation that encompasses all the evidence. The persistent challenge in finding a purely natural explanation for these events is what keeps the resurrection of Jesus in the realm of the inexplicable for human reason, driving faith. To choose a specific aspect of the central theme for a more detailed analysis, focusing on its particularities. The resurrection of Jesus, while being the pillar of Christian faith, is also constantly examined through the lens of historical and archaeological analysis. Although archaeology by its nature cannot unearth a miracle, an event that transcends natural laws, it can, and has, provide crucial context, corroborate details of biblical accounts, and at times challenge or strengthen the foundations upon which the narratives are built. In this chapter, we will focus specifically on the reliability of ancient testimonies and the context of Jesus' death, which are crucial aspects for the historical analysis of the central theme. The first particularity to be analyzed is the historicity of Jesus Christ. It is an almost universal consensus among scholars and historians, both believers and skeptics, that Jesus of Nazareth was a real historical figure who lived in Galilee in the 1st century AD. He's not a mythological figure. Non-Christian sources, contemporary or close to the period, provide external evidence to the Bible of his existence and impact. The Roman historian Tacitus, in his description of Nero's persecution of Christians, mentions Christ, from whom the name Christian derives, and that he suffered the extreme penalty under the procurator Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. Pliny the Younger, governor of Bithynia, writes to Emperor Trajan about Christians and their practices, who worship Christ as a god. More importantly, the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus mentions Jesus in 2 passages. The Testimonium Flavianum, although this passage has Christian interpolations, most scholars agree that an original core from Josephus existed, and a reference to the execution of James, Jesus' brother, identifying him as the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ. These references, outside the biblical canon, solidify Jesus' historical existence and the premise of his crucifixion. The crucifixion of Jesus under Pontius Pilate is another widely accepted historical fact. Josephus and Tacitus, as mentioned, confirm this event. Archaeology has also played its part here. The discovery of the Pilate inscription in Caesarea Maritima in 1961, a limestone block with a dedication to Tiberius by Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, is archaeological evidence that corroborates the existence and office of the key figure in Jesus' crucifixion, establishing the authenticity of the actors and the stage where the events occurred. This, while not proving the resurrection itself, attests to the historical basis of the accounts. A fascinating aspect of historical analysis is the speed of the formation and dissemination of belief in the resurrection. The earliest Christian texts, especially Paul's epistles, are dated only a few decades after the events. In 1 Corinthians 15:3-7, Paul cites a very ancient creed that already articulated Jesus' death, burial, resurrection, and his appearances to Cephas, to the 12, to more than 500 brothers at once, to James, and to all the apostles. This creed, which Paul says he received and passed on, is considered by many scholars to be a pre-Pauline formula, meaning a body of belief that was already in circulation and being taught within a few years of Jesus' crucifixion. The existence of such a formal and central creed, focused on the resurrection in such an early period, suggests that there was not enough time for a complex and fabricated legend to develop, spread so widely, and become the center of Christian faith. The memory of eyewitnesses would still be alive and capable of refuting falsehoods. The change of the day of worship from Saturday to Sunday is another powerful piece of evidence of historical impact. For Jewish converts to Christianity, the Sabbath was a central commandment of the Torah. The transition to Sunday, the Lord's Day, in celebration of Jesus' resurrection, reflects a radical and profound change in religious practices. Such a fundamental cultural and theological alteration could only have been motivated by an event of cataclysmic and unquestionable significance for the early followers. It would not be a trivial change without an extraordinary reason. These historical and archaeological factors, while not proving the miracle itself, strengthen the foundation upon which the central theme of the resurrection rests. They corroborate the historicity of Jesus and the main events, the speed with which belief in the resurrection spread, and the radical transformation of the early followers. This makes alternative explanations, which dismiss the miracle, more difficult to sustain in the face of rigorous historical examination. To address the evolution or broader implications of the central theme, connecting it to contemporary or future contexts. The resurrection of Jesus, a singular event narrated 2 millennia ago, largely transcends the boundaries of theology and religious doctrine, exerting a profound and multifaceted impact on global culture, philosophy, and, notably, on discussions with contemporary science. The mystery of the resurrection is not a relic of the past, but a living force that continues to shape thoughts, artistic expressions, and intellectual debates in modern and future scenarios. Culturally, the resurrection is undeniably one of the pillars of Western civilization. Its iconography and narrative permeate art, music, literature, and architecture almost ubiquitously. From the grandiose Gothic cathedrals, which point to the heavens and celebrate the hope of eternal life, to the Renaissance paintings of masters like Piero della Francesca and Raphael, which captured the drama of the event, the resurrection is a recurring theme. And influencing traditions in various cultures, from the symbolism of the egg and the rabbit to deep reflections on renewal and sacrifice. Philosophically, the resurrection raises profound existential questions that continue to be debated in academia and in everyday conversations. It challenges our understanding of life after death, the nature of body and soul, the purpose of human existence, and fundamentally, the possibility of divine intervention in the cosmos. For many philosophers and theologians, the resurrection of Jesus offers a radical and hopeful answer to the problem of death and suffering. suggesting that reality is not limited to what is materially observable, and that there is a transcendent dimension that can subvert known natural laws. The debate between naturalism and supernaturalism finds in the resurrection one of its most intense battlegrounds, as it is an event that, if true, challenges the premises of methodological naturalism. Regarding science, the resurrection presents itself as a paradigm challenge. Modern science operates under the principle of methodological naturalism, seeking to explain phenomena through observable, testable, and replicable natural laws. An event like the resurrection of a dead body, which returns to life and transcends known physical and biological limitations, is, by definition, beyond the reach of scientific methodology. Science can investigate the historical evidence on Jesus' death, the archaeology of the burial, or even the psychological effects of belief in miracles, but it cannot conduct an experiment to test the resurrection as a biological or physical phenomenon. This distinction between the domains of science and faith is crucial. Many thinkers, including scientists who also profess a faith, such as the renowned geneticist Francis Collins, argue that science and faith operate in different but complementary domains. For Collins, science can explain the how of the universe, the mechanisms and processes, but religion can address the why, the meaning, purpose, and the existence of miracles, which would be beyond science's explanatory capacity. Similarly, physicist and theologian John Polkinghorne argues that if God exists and is the creator of the universe, then the possibility of a new creation, like the resurrection, which transcends ordinary natural laws, is not illogical within a theistic worldview. The apparent tension between faith and science, particularly in the context of the resurrection, is in fact an area of continuous dialogue and intellectual growth. Instead of viewing science as a refutation of the resurrection, many perceive it as a powerful tool for understanding the complexity and order of creation. Meanwhile, the resurrection remains a point of intersection between the natural and the supernatural, a vivid reminder of the potentiality of the divine and the limits of our purely materialistic understanding. The mystery of the resurrection, therefore, has not only persisted but continues to invite us to ponder the limits of our own knowledge and the possibility of realities that transcend our current capacity for explanation. To conclude with a reflection on the limits of human understanding concerning the central theme and its comprehensive nature. Throughout this profound analytical journey into the resurrection of Jesus, we have navigated through the intricate biblical narratives, the early reactions of the disciples, the various secular hypotheses, and the valuable contributions of history and archaeology. Now, we reach the culmination of our reflection, the inevitable confrontation with the limits of human understanding when faced with such an extraordinary event. The resurrection forces us to confront the perennial tension between faith and reason, and invites us to ponder what, in fact, we can grasp through intellect and what, perhaps, needs to be embraced by other forms of knowledge. The human mind, by its very essence, is programmed to seek patterns, logical explanations, and coherence. We live in a universe governed by physical laws that we can observe, measure, and, in many cases, replicate in experiments. Science, as the most powerful tool of human reason, has allowed us to unravel mysteries of the cosmos and life in unimaginable ways. However, the resurrection of Jesus, conceived as a body returning to life after death and transcending known biological and physical laws, presents an insurmountable paradox for pure reason and the scientific method. If we approach the resurrection strictly through the scientific and rationalist lens, it becomes an inexplicable miracle in the literal and absolute sense. There are no observable precedents in nature, nor known biochemical or physical mechanisms that can reproduce or explain it within the natural laws governing our universe. For science, an event of this magnitude is a fundamental anomaly, and the absence of a natural and repeatable explanation leads to the conclusion that it is outside its domain of investigation. This does not constitute a scientific refutation of the resurrection itself, but rather an honest acknowledgement of the intrinsic limitations of the scientific methodology, which is restricted to what is empirical and verifiable. It is at this crucial point that faith enters the scene. Faith, in this context, should not be understood as the absence of reason or an irrational leap in the dark, but rather as a form of knowledge that transcends purely empirical evidence. For those who believe, the resurrection of Jesus is the ultimate proof of the existence of a God who is not confined by the laws he himself established. It is the supreme manifestation of divine power, capable of subverting the natural course of events to fulfill a greater purpose, the redemption of humanity and the victory over death. Faith offers a lens through which the inexplicable does not become a logical flaw, but a profound revelation of divine omnipotence and love. The resurrection, therefore, acts as a watershed between different worldviews. For the strict naturalist, who only accepts what can be empirically verified, the resurrection is invariably classified as a myth, a metaphor, or a psychological illusion. For the theist who accepts the possibility of the divine and supernatural intervention, it is the definitive proof of the truth of their faith, the culmination of biblical promises, and the guarantee of the hope of eternal life. The beauty and challenge of the central theme lie precisely in its ability to force us to examine, and perhaps redefine, our own assumptions about the nature of reality. What, then, does the resurrection reveal to us about our own perception and about what may still transcend our understanding? It teaches us that, even with all our intellectual and technological advancements, there are phenomena that may escape our capacity for categorization, measurement, and explanation. It forces us to consider the possibility that the universe is infinitely more mysterious and more full of potential and dimensions than our current science can conceive. Ultimately, the mystery of Jesus' resurrection is not a problem to be solved or an equation to be closed completely. It is, instead, a continuous invitation to awe, contemplation, and questioning. It reminds us of the vastness of the unknown and the eternal and fundamental human search for meaning. Whether that search is conducted through the rigorous paths of reason, the profound insights of faith, or a harmonious combination of both.